Hi everyone, this is Josh from Narrate. This past weekend was the second part of Narrate's series, Burden of Power. Adam asked the question, what if power is always accompanied by hidden vulnerability?
So if you weren't with us a couple weeks ago, we started this conversation on power. You might have heard there was this election happening and all kinds of things going on, and so aren't you glad that's all over? But what we said is, what if we were to stop running from this notion of power and look it in the mirror? Like, what if we were to acknowledge that all of us are in the pursuit of power and that there's right and wrong ways to use it? And really what we looked at that week was a strange reality where this God of this text, who claims to be the one true God, he seems to affirm over and over and over again that power is something he wants us to have, despite the fact that we have a propensity to misuse it. And so we introduced a couple weeks ago this idea of vulnerability, and what if, when we consider power and vulnerability kind of in concert with one another, that we can begin to think about power the way God does and really empowers us too. And this morning, I just kind of want to tell you what I'm hoping to tell you, because I don't think I'm going to tell you very well. That's such a strong word. Like I want to kind of tell you the conversation that I'd like to create, just in case I don't do a good job of that. What I want to ask is, what if any kind of power comes with vulnerability? Like what if any kind of power, anytime we acquire, whether it's relational and a new relationship or a new position or a new level of resource, what if any time we find ourselves the recipients of greater power, we also find ourselves the recipients of what I'd like to call hidden vulnerability? And what's hidden about it is sometimes it's hidden to us, right? Like I had a guy between services go like, hey, can we get together and talk about parenting? And I'm like, yeah, we can get together, but I don't have any advice. Like we can commiserate, like we could do that. Like love being a dad, don't have any qualifications. So sometimes it's hidden, right? Because you just suddenly realize like, I had no idea that it required this. And sometimes it's hidden in terms of somebody else looks at us as a boss, as a supervisor, as a parent, as a person who makes a certain amount or has a certain role. And what they don't understand is from the outside, you can't see that there's all kinds of vulnerabilities that come with that position because you're not in their shoes. And so ultimately what I want to say is, what if there are these hidden vulnerabilities? And here's why it would matter. In my estimation, you could choose to disagree. I just prefer if you don't tell me when you disagree. That's kind of this agreement we have. I'm just kidding. Kind of. I'm actually not kidding at all. My ego is very small. I can't take very much. Or very big. I guess that would make it very big, wouldn't it? Anyway, I digress. Here's why I think it would matter, is if it's true that this God wants us to have power and it embraces the reality that vulnerability comes with that, what that would mean is that it's an opportunity to sidle up next to him. Because unlike lots of spiritualities, and frankly, unlike Christian spirituality as often presented, this God in this text is not a God who says, hey, if you put the recipe together just right, you won't suffer. And if you have suffering, then you've put the recipe together incorrectly. This God doesn't roll that way. In fact, what this God does is says vulnerability is part and parcel to power. And if that's true, then we ought to expect that the most powerful being ever would also experience vulnerability at its highest level ever. And that's what we see in this God. And so this God says, hey, why don't you apprentice under me? That thing that you're feeling, that reality of dealing with suffering, why don't you sidle up next to me and let me help you walk your way through this. Now, my first, here's the picture in my head. Maybe we can start here. When you tell someone you're going on vacation to Hawaii or something, I've never been to Hawaii, but like you tell somebody I'm going on vacation and they go like, oh, I'm going to sneak into your suitcase. You know that thing that we do? And you're like, well, no, that's why I'm leaving. Like, that actually wouldn't help anything whatsoever. The idea, of course, is that we would arrive at some destination, and unbeknownst to us, we would have brought something along with us that we didn't mean to bring. I guess that's the picture that I have here, is what if there are times when we acquire power, be it in the form of a job or a relationship or any number of other things, and what we don't realize is that with that, in the suitcase along with it, so to speak, are certain vulnerabilities, but we didn't account for them. And we arrive in parenthood, we arrive in marriage, we arrive in the supervisor role, we arrive in middle school, we arrive in these areas where we just couldn't wait to have this power, and we suddenly recognize, like, wait a minute, I had no idea it involved this as well. Now, my first instance of this, or not probably my first, but I can appreciate now looking back that there was a person in my life who was really helping me try to see this, but I completely missed it. And that's part of the dynamic, right? Is you're like, well, geez, if I'd have known this came with being the boss, I wouldn't have been the boss. If I'd have known that I had to paint the house every 10 years, I would just rent apartments. Like there's that, like, if you'd have told me this comes with it, I wouldn't have done it. So in 2009, It was late February of 2009. I was in my office, and I think the reason I remember this so pointedly, and I've told parts of this story before. Sorry, I just don't have a very active life, so I have to reuse my stories. But it was in 2009 that my friend Vern came into my office. Now, I call him friend. He was a boss. In fact, I went to work. I just thought I'd show you a picture because he's a good-looking guy, right? So Vern leads this church called Harvest in Billings, which planted this one. I worked for Vern for 10 years. From the time I was 20 years old, I was an intern in the youth group that he worked for. And the reason I remember it so clearly in this February of 2009 was because Vern wasn't the type of person who just dropped in. That wasn't his leadership style. He was the type that kind of very type A, block scheduling kind of type. And so he assumed that if you needed time with him, you scheduled it and vice versa. It wasn't really a drop-in culture. But this is the one memory I have of him dropping into my office. Now, there were a few circumstances, not the least of which was I had just come back from Portland, studying at George Fox for 10 days, hanging out with my friend Brian Hopkins, who was the other church who helped plant this. And I was moving in less than I moved May 2nd. So my family and I moved here on May 2nd of that year. So I think he was just kind of checking in. I know that I was waxing eloquent, if you know what I mean. You fire the boss, like I'm going to fire my boss and be my own boss, like that kind of thing. And that wasn't my attitude at all. But I just have no doubt that I was waxing eloquent and pontificating about this perfect church that we were going to plant in Helena and all the ways that we had all the world's problems about church figured out. And I hope I wasn't that arrogant, but I know that's kind of the way I was talking. And the context here, I think, is important. Vern, because in reality, what I was doing was articulating this perfect church, and I was completely insensitive to the fact that he was 10 years into leading one, and there was some vulnerability that came with that. And all I'm talking about is how perfect it's going to be. Now, here's to get to know Vern a little bit. When you open the dictionary and you look up the word charismatic, like his face is there. When you look up articulate, his face is there. When you look up hilarious, his face is there. Like he's a phenomenal communicator, a phenomenal leader. He's one of those guys and this would have been what 20-year-old and even 30-year-old me would have said was like everything he touches turns to gold. Because you see those people who are just so stinking talented. And it's just like, man, I wish everything came as easy to me as it comes to you. When I went to work for him in the youth group, I didn't grow up in youth group. I grew up going to CCD. It's nothing like youth group. I hadn't been there since I was 14. I couldn't believe my job was like vacuum and set up and tear down, that kind of thing. There were 200 students in the room. And they weren't like drugged by their ears, they wanted to be there. I quickly began to learn that like youth group under Vern, it was the best church in town. The communication, the experience that he created, it was phenomenal. And in fact, a couple months later, he did this ski retreat to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, which is no small feat in of. It's like 8 hours from Billings in February in a blizzard. He filled 2 charter buses and 2 15-passenger vans. Now, you're this like, wow. I mean, so if you kind of go like, you're going to give somebody else a complex. Exactly. That's what it's like to hang out around this guy. Because if he does it, it turns to gold. I think it was in May, there was a guy who owned a nursery in Billings, and he talked him into turning his sprinklers on these fields that he had. He just turned the sprinklers on for like 3 days, and it made mud up to your knees. And then hundreds of students formed these football teams, and they played mud football in these fields. And there was a kid who broke his leg, and he got to go to the hospital. I mean, that was just Vern's style. The next year, and this was the plan all along, he went and started Harvest. It was planted by that church he worked for. It started with 300 people. Within a year, it was 1,000 people. Within a few years, it was a couple thousand people. Within 5 years, they had purchased 30-some acres of land in the Billings Heights and built like a $7 million facility, almost entirely debt-free. So that's Vern. I mean, it's just like, oh, geez, this must be easy. Wow, everything happens, and it's amazing and astounding. Here's what I wasn't sensitive to, is part of the political climate of Billings is such that the Billings Heights is part of the city limits, and it's about, 20% of the population of Billings, maybe 25%, which means when a ballot initiative comes up for Billings, 100% of the people vote on it, but if it's for the Heights, say a swimming pool, 75% of the people are never going to use it, so they could never pass anything for themselves. Well, there was a swimming pool, actually, that they'd tried to pass for several years. It didn't pass. Vern, one morning, was sitting on his mantle reading his paper the next morning, and he saw that it failed again, and he felt like God was saying to him, you guys build it, and you give it to the city. And we're not talking like, let's go to Walmart and buy one of those above-ground pools, and we'll, put it in a park. We're talking a several $million aquatic center, not unlike the one in Missoula, if you've ever been there, outdoor water slides, the whole deal. So what commenced then was him taking all of his leadership acumen and all of his credibility and all of his power and leading this community of people through this idea of sacrificing from their own family budget to do a capital campaign, to give millions of dollars, to give a pool that they would also ultimately give away as an expression to God. Aren't you glad we just do egg hunts? And it started really well. And then some things started to happen, not the least of which was the financial crisis of 2008. And things kind of started to lose some momentum. Now, again, I wasn't sensitive to any of this at the time. What I can look back and see is some of the most trusted voices at Harvest were leaving because there was this underground, like, we're not for it. We don't buy into it. We don't want to do it. People were going back on their financial commitments. It's kind of gross to even say out loud, but in hindsight, I can see about half the staff, there was about 60 people on staff there when I left, about half the staff really deep down weren't for it, and behind the scenes were having conversations that were really opposed to it. Some of his closest friends, the type of people that he thought would climb any hill, carry anything with him, were going like, no, you lost me on this one. And so that was the context. And I remember him as I was waxing eloquent, he looked at me and he had this, you can tell when someone's face is withholding emotion, right? And it wasn't a face of contempt. It was a face of great pain, sorrow, grief. And he looked at me, self-doubt perhaps. And clearly with eyes that were watery, he looked at me and said, Adam, don't ever forget that vision is cheap. It's easy. And that's all I remember of the conversation. And now I look back and I go, it's the vulnerability piece. Yeah, you're now the leader of this thousands and thousands of people in this church and all this money and all these different things. And suddenly the dark underbelly that comes with it is what he was experiencing. This is the God of the text. In Genesis chapter 1, this God, the God of Genesis, he's introduced to us as this all-powerful being. And what's unique about Genesis and its account is other cultures also had creation accounts, but they always involved a plethora of gods competing against one another. This account says there's only one being worthy of the name God, and he, in fact, can take chaos and bring order from it. This God has all the power. He's not usurped by these other gods or these dark powers. And this God, within the creation experience, chooses to create people. And while he doesn't make people little gods, it's close. Because what the text says is God gives people, you and I and every other person, God-like responsibilities and opportunities. He gives them power. He gives us autonomy. And thus begins, it seems to me, the paradox of power, because you have this all-powerful being who by all rights can keep it for himself. And he chooses to share some, which in turn makes him vulnerable. Because when you share something with somebody, they can prize it, they can treasure it, they can treat it the way you would, or they can do whatever the heck they want with it. And that's the dynamic of the text. That's the biblical narrative. This reminds me of a couple weeks ago, well, back up from there. There's a relationship, since we're walking down nostalgia lane, I might as well just stay in the lane. There's a guy that years ago when we were in a portable church in Billings in Skyview High School, part of the vision even of this place of like, come serve with us and you'll meet people, was born of this experience I had with this guy who we set up Harvest Kids almost every Sunday morning together. And I was this young 20-something guy, and I was enamored by him. I'm guessing he was in his early 30s at the time, maybe late 20s. He's this like 6'4", max, like 240 guy. Used to play defensive line for the Grizz during the Dave Dickinson championship years. I mean, just this larger-than-life figure who had all kinds of fascinating stories. He also had the type of job with the federal government that required him to bear arms at all time, if you know what I mean. And I remember picking his brain about that, and then September 11th happened, and we kind of had all those conversations about that. And one day we were, actually I think we were pounding stakes for what would be the Harvest building in a field. It was July, and as Sarah would say, hot as Hades. And so he showed up, and he was wearing shorts and a T-shirt, and I remember going, and like sandals, and I remember going, I thought you said you had to pack all the time. And he just looked at me like, who said I'm not packing? My imagination doesn't have many options. Let's just keep going. So that was this guy. I mean, he's just this larger-than-life kind of behemoth of a dude. He was also a Raiders fan. Yeah, see, he just threw up in his mouth too. So, but it's one thing to give a Raiders fan a hard time if he, doesn't watch football. It's another thing when he's actually played football, and I've never done that. And so we would have these fun exchanges, and that was in the years when they actually won games. So fast forward a few years ago, he and his family moved here, and they're a part of this place. And oftentimes in the 10 o'clock, he'll be sitting out there, and I'll make a Raiders joke, and I'll look right at him because, speaking of abuse of power, I have a microphone, and all he has is a gun. I don't know. Just kidding. That's not a good illusion. So a few Sundays ago, remember the Broncos played the Raiders on Sunday night, and the Broncos got annihilated, and that was not very surprising, and suddenly all the Broncos fans have their tail between their legs. I was outside helping a guy with a parking situation, and here he came with his family walking across Lawrence, and here's this behemoth of a man, larger than life, walking across the street, wearing an authentic Raiders jersey. And his smile went off of his face. He knew exactly what he was doing. He's staring at me like, ha, ha, ha. I later realized, it was so authentic. It even had his name. It wasn't like, hey, let's go to Universal and have some, put some vinyl on the back. Sewn on letters on the back. And as I looked at him and his family, to the far left, his oldest son was also walking with them. He's a sixth grader. And he, who will soon be larger than life as well, based upon his DNA, he was wearing a Bronco jersey. Right? And I remember going what is happening here? And we had this exchange, I can't believe it. Congratulations, way to go, good job. But the whole thing threw me off. And I remember that night I was telling my wife, I was telling this story, and I was like, and his son had a Bronco jersey on. And she said, well, I just really respect that he had the right to choose. And I thought, yeah, me too, superficially. I've had that nightmare. I don't want to live it, but I'm glad he's living it out. That's the God of the text at the risk of trivializing it. This God has all power, all authority, and he is fully capable and chooses to put it all, not all, large doses of it on your plate, and you don't get to choose trivial things like NFL football teams, but eternal things. That's the way this God rolls. He embraces vulnerability, and here's the deal. I don't know how you're vulnerable. I don't know in what ways your power is wearing you out, but I know it does. Whether you can put words to it, whether this is actually helping you describe what you're experiencing or you already have, right? Because you picked up the bag, you got the job. No one told you had to work on Thanksgiving and pay taxes. And no one explained that with becoming the owner means you're never off. No one explained that to you. No one explained that you don't get to have a bad day as the boss, right? Or as the employee, you got the job, and you didn't know you'd be stepping into that kind of culture, scrutinized in those kinds of ways. Or you get the relationship, and this happens. You get the relationship, and it's all exciting, and then you realize, wait a minute, there's some burdensome nature to this relationship thing. Because they don't just happen, they take work. And sometimes you end up years, even decades into a relationship, and you go I don't think this is healthy. I think this might be toxic. And sometimes you got to make these hard, like divorce is the burden of power, isn't it? Death. No matter how healthy your marriage is, someone's burying somebody unless you're a very small statistic. Right? That's happening for all of us. Financially, there are these things that happen financially, and you go I didn't. Listen, I don't know in what ways you're experiencing power and in what ways you're experiencing vulnerability, but whether you can identify it. Suddenly you're in sixth grade and you thought life was perfect. Suddenly I'll get all this freedom. And there's what? No one told me that would be the culture of the hallway. You thought you'd be, the captain of the team. There's this thing, and here to me is the good news, is Jesus comes alongside and goes, I'd love to coach you through that. I'd love to take this idea of following me and moving it from the cerebral, kind of intellectual, what you think about in a library, to what happens in real life. This is where I love the way Dallas Willard speaks about what it means to follow Jesus. He calls it being an apprentice. Because the design is that we have the living God in flesh and blood in Jesus. We have 4 Gospels. We can familiarize ourselves with what he does in certain situations the same way a plumber would when he's apprenticing as a plumber. Oh, so in that situation, you turn the wrench this way, huh? And you run the pipe that way. Okay, great. That's what this guy does. And when it comes to having power and being misunderstood, if this whole thesis is true, it would mean that the greater the power you have, the greater the vulnerability. And that's certainly Jesus' story. In fact, he was misunderstood more than any boss, any leader, any parent, any spouse. He kept saying to his guys, hey, guys, I'm kind of feeling vulnerable. And they're like, what are you talking about? You're going to be the king of the world. Like, we're headed to Jerusalem. We're going to give you a crown and a throne and off with Caesar's head. Like, this is going to be perfect. One time, this woman came up to him and she poured all this expensive perfume on his head. And his disciples were like, oh, that's like when King David was anointed with oil. Certainly, this is a sign that you're going to become king. And Jesus is like, no. She just anointed me for my burial. And they're like, you use such dark metaphors. And he's going, it's not a metaphor. On 3 separate occasions in the Gospels, Jesus says to him, hey, we're going to Jerusalem so that I can die. And they're like, we don't get it. We don't understand what's going on here. In one of those instances, they so didn't get it that after it was all over, a couple of them came up to him and like, hey, when the hard days happened that you're talking about, they had no notion of death. I mean, they had notion of death, but not of his dying. They thought he was just like, oh, so it's going to be a struggle, and all of a sudden, boom, you'll be in. And they come up to him and they said, hey, so when you're finally in, when you're finally on the throne, could one of us be your VP and the other one your Secretary of State? And listen to what Jesus says in verse Mark 10:38. He says, you don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? Like, do you even have a clue? Do you have any idea how vulnerable this is making me? And listen to their response. I love their response. Verse 39, yeah, we can. Oh, yeah, we can do that, right? Because, yeah, we can do that. We could parent. How hard could it be? We could be the boss. Yeah, we got that. And Jesus is like, I don't think you do. And then he bears down a little bit more. Listen to 10, verse 42. Jesus called them together and he said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. In other words, he's like, you know that in some contexts, power is all about sheltering yourself from, shielding yourself from vulnerability. And then he simply says this, not so with you. In other words, we do power differently. Like in my kingdom, which at this point isn't a space so much as a character, it'll be a space eventually. He's going, we do power differently. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. In other words, you guys, if you're going to follow me, if you're going to apprentice under the way I use power, he's saying, there's no using it to protect yourself from vulnerability. In fact, the more of it you have, the more vulnerable you become. That's the deal. And now, can that go too far? Of course it can go too far. Is there a point at which serving becomes toxic? Yeah, and we're going to talk about that actually in January in a series called Give and Take. But nonetheless, he's saying your default is to not shelter yourself from vulnerability, but use your power to serve others. The most secure document in the U.S. government is called the President's Daily Brief. It's been delivered to presidents, no matter which party, since 1961. It's now delivered more electronically. But going all the way back to 1961, presidents, all of them, they start their day 365 days a year, whether it's their birthday or Christmas or the 4th of July, whether they're in Europe or they're on their own soil in Washington, D.C., they get up. And some point early in the day, they slide into a room where the National Security Advisor gives them some form of documentation, whether it be digitally or paper. And here's what the President's Daily Brief does. It outlines everything the vast network of U.S. intelligence has learned in the last 24 hours. It says everything that they've learned about the threats that the U.S. sees. It's an unvarnished, absolutely thorough documentation of here's all the things that could happen today that could end our way of life as we know it. And a glimpse at a few of the decisions we're going to need you to make. In fact, there's only been one of these ever released, made public, and even that was just a 2-page part of the memo. That piece was released, it was originally issued on August 6, 2001. It was titled, Bin Laden Determined to Strike U.S. So the president, all-powerful, this person that we look at who's got it all going on, all kinds of power, no challenges whatsoever. The president starts his day by getting acquainted with all this information. And then he has breakfast. Perhaps he kisses his wife and says goodbye to his kids for the day, has press conferences and answers questions and travels the country and the world. And the whole time, while looking like nothing but a powerful being, the whole time he does it, knowing full well a whole bunch of information that he can tell nobody, and almost no one on the planet knows, knowing full well that just a couple things could happen today, and if he doesn't make the right decision, life as we know it is over. It's the power of vulnerability. It's the burden of power. It's what Andy Crouch calls the drama of leadership. And it's what Jesus is saying to his guys is, guys, this isn't about gaining something so that life becomes more safe. It's about embracing something. Look at verse 45. For even the Son of Man, he said, did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. We have been trying to conceive of a Jesus without the cross for 2,000 years. And the Gospels won't let us. That it's not a paradox for them, or if it is, it's not one they're trying to avoid, that with power comes vulnerability. So I guess the question is, so in what ways is there hidden vulnerability? And could it be that there's the personal component for you? Could this also be why Paul speaks so matter-of-factly about praying for our leaders? It's not a political comment. It's not a pray for the ones you agree with. Could it be that that's part of what's going on there? Is Paul going, wait a minute, even Caesar has these hidden vulnerabilities that you can't even begin to appreciate the weight with which he has to deal with them. You know, my friend Fred, who was wildly influential on me in my 20s, he's 20, probably 30 years older than me. His dad was a World War II vet, and so he always had these war stories, and he's very much kind of a war kind of guy, loves guns and those types of things. And he used to always say to me, I have no doubt when I was complaining about leadership somewhere and, you know, the things that we used to do, where you second-guess decisions being made and stuff. And he'd always say, Adam, nobody wants to be the captain who has to make a decision that we've got to take this hill. But in order to take the hill, 20 guys have to die. It's like, nobody wants that decision, he said. But somebody has to make that decision. Someone's got to be that guy. You know, I think even this week was just reading up about General Douglas MacArthur. I mean, think of this. In World War II, he was in charge of the Pacific Fleet during World War II. In World War II, as they were trying to figure out how to knock out the imperial regime of Japan, he understood that there was this postage stamp of land called Iwo Jima. It was in so many circumstances completely insignificant, but absolutely necessary if the U.S. was going to win this war and stop Japan short in its tracks. He understood that there were 20,000 Japanese people on that island, and that they were so afraid of U.S. soldiers, and there were so many false truths about the way captives were treated, that every one of them would die before they would be taken prisoner of war. He understood, therefore, and ultimately was central to the decision to drop 70,000 U.S. troops on Iwo Jima. He did that knowing that the death rate would be extraordinarily high. In the end, nearly every one of those 20,000 Japanese people died. Around 7,000 U.S. soldiers died. Another 18,000 were wounded in war and became casualties in some capacity. So let's just get that straight. General MacArthur made a decision that required, almost 30,000 people to die. He made a decision that this island was strategic, and knew that 1 in 7 men that he would send to that island would never speak to their wives or mothers or kids again. What is that? It's the burden of power. It's something we see Moses dealing with. Remember, God comes to Moses, and he's like, hey, Moses, I would like you to go lead the people of Israel out of Egypt. And Moses is like, earth to God. We tried that. It didn't work, so I packed my Winnebago, and I'm having a pretty good life in the desert, so find somebody else. It didn't work at all. And then he finally says to God, okay, who am I that I can do this? I can't do this. Like, who am I to think I can do this? And like when you say that, you're looking for someone to kind of reaffirm, like, well, here's all the reasons why you could do that. And God's response, I'll be with you. In other words, yeah, you're kind of pathetic, but that's kind of not going to be the equalizer here. It's going to be me this time around. And then Moses says to him a very cultural thing. Whose name do you want me to tell the people? Because Egypt, they had gods coming out their ears. So what's the name of the God that I'm going to tell the people that's somehow going to garner confidence among them that this is you? And listen to what God says. God said to Moses, I am who I am. Like, what am I talking to here? Popeye? Like, that's not even an answer to my question. This is what you're to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. John Goldingay, one of my favorite scholars, he points out, like, he didn't even answer Moses' question. And that name there is full of mystery. Here's the way this astute Bible scholar explains it. He says that perhaps what's going on there is God can't give Moses a name for himself that accurately encapsulates everything about his identity. And so instead what he says to Moses is, hey, Moses, here's what I can tell you. I will be who you need me to be. And you just go tell Israel that the God who has sent you will be who they need him to be in the daily. So don't step away from the vulnerability. He's saying, step into it and know I'll give you what you need for the day. Listen, in just a minute, we're going to celebrate through communion. There will be elements over here and over here. Just to be clear, we dip, we don't sip, because we're germaphobes. I can't think of anything that more encapsulates the vulnerability of God. Jesus' body broken, his blood poured out, a reminder to us that with absolute power comes absolute vulnerability. That love embraces vulnerability, it doesn't run from it, and it's a reflection back to us that this is what it means to follow him, to embrace a life of vulnerability. So let me pray and I'll get out of your way. Lord, thank you, God, for becoming flesh, for putting our lives on so that we can apprentice from you. And thanks, God, that in the midst of all the pain and all the suffering and all the hurt and all the vulnerability that comes with being a middle school student or a parent or a boss or an employee, that you repeatedly point us back to the place that vulnerability is the place of life, not of death. That paradoxically, suffering doesn't mean an absence of you, but a heightened understanding of what you're about. We love you. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.